podcast where nothing's off the table. From Bible mysteries and strange phenomena to the questions that keep you up at night, we explore it all with curiosity and faith. I'm your host, Courtney, joined by my co-hosts Caleb and Jeremy. Together, we dive into the weird, the wonderful, and the wildly curious. So grab your coffee, open your mind, and let's babble. Thank y'all for tuning in. This episode is going to be somewhat of a part 2 to an episode we have done previously called Time and the Transcendent. If you haven't listened to that yet, I encourage you to go and listen. It's really good. We kind of just talk about the movie Interstellar and we get into some deep discussion about God and time. And at the end of that episode, it really kind of opened up some questions about another topic that we wanted to kind of talk about today. So we're kind of considering this almost a part 2. So what are we going to be babbling about today?
We will be babbling about free will and the sovereignty of God.
Yeah.
We're going to answer all of your questions definitively in such a way that no one could possibly disagree. Prepare yourself.
Yeah, we'll settle a centuries-old debate today.
Yeah, that has to be wrong. All right, so we're talking about God's sovereignty, providence, and really just kind of diving into there's this tension in that, right? We have God's sovereignty, his authority, and then we have our free will. So where do we want to kind of start there? I have lots of questions, but I don't know if y'all want to say anything. We want to kind of explain when we say God's providence, like what we mean by that.
Yeah, so there are some related terms here. I mean, because there's some overlap. When we talk about the sovereignty of God, what I mean when I use that term is the authority and controlling will of God, right? Which he's justified in having because he's the creator of the universe.
Right.
He's the boss.
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to, basically.
Yeah, he's in charge. And so God is in charge. That's basically what we're talking about when we talk about the sovereignty of God. And all things that happen, all things that occur in the context of that authority and that sovereignty, right? And so that's one thing that, because what we're trying to sort of, the tension that we're addressing is a biblical tension, right? There are a couple of different things that the scripture is going to clearly tell us. And lots of people throughout time have said, well, wait a second, these things, these two different things that scripture affirms seem to be at each other's throats, right? It seems to be like a conflict between the two. And the first one is God's control and his authority. He is sovereign over all things. And I think scripture is pretty clear that that is the case, that God is sovereign. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jeremy?
No, just other than the fact that this relates to a lot of bigger apologetics questions. I think for Christians, we come at it from the lens of sovereignty and free will.
Yeah.
I think for people who are skeptical of God or of Christianity, they come at it from the lens of kind of what's kind of reductively stated sometimes as like, if God real, why bad thing happen? Which is the memeified version of it. But there is, you can see how that's an objection, right? If God really is in control and really is as great as you say, why does all this stuff happen that it seems like a good God wouldn't agree with?
Yeah.
So we're just going to get at one side of that issue today. There's so much more to say.
Yeah, we can talk about the problem of evil on another episode.
Yeah, we're going to have to do that.
But it is related to this, and I just, want to mention that at the outset.
So I think what you just referenced there is kind of the main point of conflict with the doctrine of God's sovereignty is the other thing that Scripture seems to clearly affirm, at least on its surface, which is the free will of humanity. That this idea that humans have free will. And it's like, well, if we have this claim in Scripture that the will of God and the authority of God is preeminent above all things, and yet also this affirmation that humans have free will, it seems like those two things might be pitted against each other, and something's got to give. And if something has to give, which one is it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and there's so many questions that I have, and I mean, it really does tie into our salvation, right? Because if we truly have free will versus is God controlling everything, and how does that really align with like us becoming saved? Do we have the option of accepting Christ, or is he accepting for us? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I know there's lots of questions, but I guess how can our choices really be free if we serve a sovereign God?
Yeah, I guess one one of the questions that I have, I suppose, is this question of our free will even a really coherent question?
Okay.
It might be helpful if we sort of define what do we mean when we're talking about free will, and do we think just on the surface of it this is the sort of thing that we actually possess?
Mm.
Mhm.
And because the rest of the conversation might be moot if the whole premise is incoherent at all. So I guess maybe that would be a question maybe I want to pose to you guys is
Mhm.
Okay.
if I say free will, um, what would be your definition of that? What do you think it means to say that I have free will or that you have free will?
I would say my definition is that within the circumstances and with the givens that you find yourself presented with, you have the ability to make meaningful choices.
Mm,
That's my definition. I think the popular definition of free will, which is not totally opposed to that, but which has different levels of meaning that I think are problematic, is a very romantic definition of free will. And I'm using romantic in a technical sense here, as in coming from the Romance movement in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe,
mm,
where you have the idea of what it boils down to is the soul, right? The individual soul that's being exalted um, over and above nature, over and above industrialization, over and above the modern world.
mm,
And in some works, you can see this in Goethe's Faust, for example, over and above traditional morality and spiritual reality and the status quo, to where the message is that you must stand in defiance of everything that exists and assert your will and have, even if it's tragic, leave some kind of mark. And that is the meaning of true freedom.
mm.
And I think that's a very problematic view of freedom, but it's one that, because our culture is downstream from that, it's one that a lot of people have adopted. Basically, if you want to boil it down into simple terms, it's the idea that I can do what I want, and even if I fail, I'm going to try.
Hmm.
But ultimately, I'm going to do what I want. And outside of any parameters or any sort of concessions to the outside world and reality and the status quo.
Mm.
Yeah, so you're I take part of what you're saying to be in relation to the fact that there are some guardrails
Mhm.
to the human will.
I wouldn't say guardrails so much as necessary reality.
Yeah.
You have to admit, if you say human will, you have to say, well, what is a human?
Mm,
What's a human's proper role? What's a human's proper place in the created order? The problem with the romantic notion is that it just wants to think about will in general, the will, the spirit, the triumph of the will, right? Um, and that's problematic because it's like, well, we don't just have wills, we have human wills. We are humans.
yeah.
What's our proper place? We can do meaningful things as humans, but we can't escape the fact that we are human beings.
Yeah, so there are whether you want to use the guardrail language or not, but there are or there should be naturally as a result of our of who we are or
Yes.
what we are, there are
Well, there
limitations.
are
Yeah,
limitations. We should acknowledge them.
yeah, yeah. That's good.
Well, when I think of free will too, I mean, it is the one word that comes to my mind is choice. We have the ability to make choices. What we don't have the ability to do is to present ourselves with those choices, I guess, if that
Mm,
makes sense. And those choices come from other people's choices, but also just from nature and God. And so but just having that ability to make a choice, I guess, is
Yeah.
the dumb
so that's interesting.
essence.
So it sounded like you were making a distinction about the fact that we have the ability to choose, but we don't decide what the choices are,
Mm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the realm of possibilities is something outside of our control.
Yeah, yeah.
I would
Yeah.
agree with
Just a
that.
better
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
of thinking what's in my brain right
Mhm.
now.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess the way that I would define freedom and with respect to the will is There's a couple of different ways, and I'm sort of undecided a little bit about which one is the particular one, but I think something in this ballpark is probably right. Sometimes philosophers will talk about something called the PAP, the PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities.
Okay.
Now, that's a fancy way of saying the ability to do otherwise, right? So if you have this capacity to do one thing, or you have the ability to do otherwise, you
Yeah.
can do something other than that choice. So a lot of philosophers will just take that as that's a prerequisite for free will. Like you
Mhm.
need that ability. And if you have that ability, the ability to do A or not
Yeah.
A, as they'll say it, then you have free will.
Mhm.
Now, I think in more recent times, there have been some pretty interesting work. I won't say that it's definitive, but some pretty interesting work where people have thought about this and said, well, actually, maybe it's not explicitly, maybe you don't even really need the true ability to do otherwise, but really maybe what you need is just the ability to act without coercion, right? So
Yes.
so the ability to do something, to choose to act without some outside force outside of yourself coercing you to do A or not
Yeah.
A.
The difficulty is, how do you define coercion?
Yes.
Because there are some philosophers, some radical philosophers, who would say that, well, physical limitations are a form of coercion,
Which is absurd.
right? It's absurd, but there are people who
No,
think
you're
that.
right. Yeah, you're right. This question of what it amounts to coercion, I think, is a complicated issue. I almost kind of want to marry the two options that I presented: the principle of alternative possibilities, the ability to do otherwise, and the ability to act without coercion. I almost want to say they're not as different, maybe on the surface, as you think, because even in the case where it's the ability to, because the claim for that one is, look, as long as you don't have outside coercion, even if you don't have an alternative possibility, even if there's only one possibility, as long as you can act without being coerced to
Mhm.
act, then it's still a free choice, even if it's the only choice.
Yeah, I guess my mind struggles wrapping my head around how do you have a choice if there's not an alternative?
Yeah. So,
That's hard for me
Yeah.
to wrap
yeah,
my head
I
around.
think the intuition you're having is strong for most people.
Yeah.
And what I would say, I think I want to agree with that intuition, but I would just want to give a caveat to
Mm.
say that, look, yes, you do need an alternative, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an alternative choice or an alternative option, because what you can have, I think this would satisfy the itch in your brain, which would just say that you at least need the capacity to not act.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a yes or no.
Right.
So, to put this in concrete terms, an alternative choice could be, I'm going to go to Chick fil A or I'm going to go to Bojangles.
Hmm.
But what you're saying is, if Chick fil A is the only restaurant in town, you still have a choice. You can go to Chick fil A or you can just not go
You
anywhere.
can refrain from action, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so I think that satisfies the requirement, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it is you're still enacting your volition, your agency,
Mm.
even in the refraining from action in
Yeah.
that case.
Okay.
And as long as in either of those cases, whether you have multiple possibilities, Chick-fil-A or Bojangles, or you only have the one, Chick-fil-A or refraining from action, as long as there's no coercive act from outside yourself that's forcing you to do it, no one's holding you at gunpoint
Right.
and making you go to Chick-fil-A.
Mm.
And there are some people who would say that's not even enough coercion to remove free will.
Yeah, but
That's on the other side of the ones who say that physical limits are
right, but
coercive. But
maybe,
we don't
well,
have to get into all that.
well,
I just want to point it out
no,
for
you're
our
right.
viewers at
Yeah, but
home.
maybe I could make the illustration a little better and say, well, it's like the government's doing MK Ultra on you, and they're
Oh
actually
no.
they're actually mind controlling you to go to. Now that would be coercion.
Maybe we'll have a podcast on NK Ultra.
Let's
We're
do
gonna
it.
have to.
But anyway, yeah, I think that would kind of be the definition that I would want to give for free will. At the minimum, maybe the principle of alternative possibilities, but at the minimum, the lack of coercion and the ability to act or not act.
Yeah.
Those are the things that sort of make free will what I conceive it to be.
Mhm.
And I hate to be, I know I'm maybe taking on your role a little bit, Courtney, and
No, you're
asking
fine.
questions here, but I'm curious about what you guys think about this. Like, based on those definitions, do you think that we have free will?
Yes, I
Hmm.
do.
Okay.
Yeah,
You think so?
I I do, and my reasoning is I'm convinced philosophically, but more foundationally, I think there's a meta philosophical reason. What I mean by that is like it's not technically philosophical,
Mhm.
but it kind of like lies behind all of the philosophical reasoning in the first place. If we don't have free will, we can't function as human beings. Like even if our choices are an illusion, we still have to believe that we have a choice. Otherwise, we would shut down. I mean, there are not, especially Russian novelists who have discussed particular forms of this question.
Yeah.
But if you think
Are
you
you saying there's
are,
something of value in a Russian
I
novelist?
am just not the writing, but
Oh
Y'all are
um,
gosh.
Russian novelists.
but think about it, right? If you don't think that your choices matter and you really believe that, first of all, I don't know if it's possible to really believe that. But if you really believe that, then what happens is you stop making choices or you just go through on autopilot to where you don't even recognize you're making choices.
Yeah.
And so I think it's one of those things like you have to believe that you're not just a brain in a jar. You have to believe that you have free will. There are certain things you just have to believe
Yeah.
to live life as a human being.
Well, I don't struggle with the idea that we do or don't have free will. I feel
Mhm.
pretty confident that we have free will. I think where I and probably most Christians or non-Christians struggle with is what role does God play in that free will?
Oh yeah,
You
that's a
know,
good
like
point.
what it's not like yeah, we have free will, but what role does God play in that? Is he somehow controlling those choices? Is he controlling what's presented to us? How much, how much is his hand really in our world?
Yeah. So I think that they are related though,
Yeah.
because think about it this way, okay? The example that I gave about coercion, right? If there is any worry in your mind about God um, pulling on puppet strings, so to speak, then that would be coercion,
Hmm.
right? In which case, the you don't have free will, right?
Mhm.
And I think but it's interesting to hear you say that you don't have a worry about the fact that you have the ability to make choices, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think, like Jeremy was sort of explaining, like sort of everyone kind of operates under this
Hmm.
assumption
Even if
because
they say they don't.
even if they claim, yeah, well, I
Yeah.
mean, people like Sam Harris, for
Yeah.
example, who he's an atheist, but he doesn't believe in free will because he thinks that all prior conditions and causes,
Yeah.
sort of like a
He
domino effect, force him to do whatever he
that
does.
that idea, by the way, is called determinism.
Yes,
It's the idea that like everything that exists is a giant mechanism. You're a part of that giant mechanism. You have no more choice than the gear in a watch,
right,
for example.
exactly. But he doesn't live his life that way,
Exactly.
and
Because you
he
can't.
also
To his yeah, you just can't.
you can't. He also does lots of virtue signaling about the way people should live their lives, which I find ironic, given that he doesn't think we have any free will to obey what his advice is. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. I think that this experience that we have of free will is really profound and really like basic foundational level for most humans in such a way that I've heard philosophers say something like this, and I think this is really true. Whatever argument you have for the idea that we do not have free will,
Hmm.
it has to be more powerful than the experience that I have of free will,
Right.
right? So any defeater you have for my having freedom has to be more powerful than the experience that I have that intuitively tells me I have it.
Mm.
Yes.
That's going to be a really high bar to cross.
Well, it is a really hard bar. It's kind of like convincing someone that like they don't actually love their parents or something like that.
Or maybe that other people don't exist,
Yeah, or exactly. That's a good example too. It's
right?
like
Solipsism is
yeah,
true. Everyone else is fictional. I'm the only one who's really
yeah.
exists. You would have to have some kind of overwhelming, convincing argument for that.
You can also look at it in terms of what you could call it the teleology of it,
Mhm,
or what are the necessary results of believing such a thing.
mm,
if you don't believe in free will, what are the consequences? And for many of these kinds of things, what ends up is that it's kind of a self-defeating argument, right?
Yeah.
If you believe we don't have free will, then ultimately you have to believe that whether or not we talk about free will, the same thing is going to happen. It's all pre-programmed anyway.
Mm.
So there's a way in which, not as directly as some other issues, there's a way in which it kind of invalidates its own significance if you start believing some of these
Yeah.
things.
So if I produce an argument,
Yeah.
let's say I do a deductive philosophical argument that free will is illusory, it's not real.
Mhm.
Um, well, then you could argue that my presuppositions for the argument and my production of the argument was outside of my own will,
Yes, exactly.
which invalidates my cognitive faculties in
Right.
producing the argument.
Which says that, even if we're going through the play of seeming like we're having an intellectual discussion, there really is no such thing as the intellect in
That's
any
right.
in any meaningful way.
Right.
And this is what goes back to just the fundamental thing about experience. It's like we have to believe ideas matter if we're going to talk about ideas.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just getting punked by the universe, right? We think we're talking about important things, but we're really just little cogs flipping around at predetermined intervals.
Yeah. I agree with that.
So this is a pretty deep topic to be discussing. And I'm sure I know of a few myself, and I know y'all know of more, but there's different Christians have different viewpoints on this.
Mhm.
So maybe we
Very
can kind
different.
of, yeah, maybe we can kind of, maybe by getting into that will help us to kind of answer some of these tough questions. Is that okay to kind
That's
of dive
fine.
into that? So who wants to kind of start? I'm just going to pose this question. What are the different viewpoints? Maybe, yeah, a brief overview of them first, and then we'll dive into it.
I'm sure some of our listeners, when we say free will and God, are already thinking of a couple of really, really big buzzwords in
Hmm.
Christian
Yeah.
theological circles.
What could they be?
I wonder.
Calvinism.
And there's
Calvinism.
the elephant.
Yeah. John Calvin. So the thing is Calvinism is going to be the one that dominate the discussion
Mhm.
because, and for good reason, which is that Calvin's point of view. There were other reformers who had views on this particular
Mhm.
issue with the sovereignty of God and the free will of humanity. But really, I think it's safe to say historically, Calvin kind of won the day. Um,
Among the
among the
reformers. Yeah.
reformers,
And,
yes.
and it's important also, this is just a little aside, but Calvinism is not exactly the same thing as Reformed, although there's a lot of overlap on that Venn diagram.
Yeah, and because he historically won the day, they've
Yeah.
become synonymous in
Yes.
modern
Mhm.
Yes.
times. And so and even the interesting thing, and this will depend on who you talk to, but even among like Catholic theologians, many Catholics will fall under many will fall under Thomistic
Hmm.
point of view, which is too complicated for us to discuss today.
Can you give
Or
me a slight definition of it?
no,
Okay. I have
To,
no
to,
idea what that means.
Thomism is it's kind of like if you developed I'm not going to define it, but just to kind of give you a way to relate it to Calvinism versus Arminianism, it's like discussing the free will and God's sovereignty as if Calvinism was not your primary opponent, and just
yeah,
kind of rolling with it's almost like it's like the
it's worse
Galapagos
than that.
Island. Yeah, it's almost like the Galapagos Islands, and you go to one island and like there's this one environmental factor that's like shaping everything, and then you go to another island and it's not there.
Yeah,
Like that's kind of like, Thomism is on this island,
yeah.
Calvinism,
So it's
Arminianism is on this one.
another point of view
It's a it's a
around.
It's
different
on a
point of
different
view. It's
wavelength.
the basic definition is that Thomistic theology follows the teaching of Thomas Aquinas,
Mhm.
Okay. Okay.
and Thomas Aquinas basically married um, Augustinian theology
Mhm.
with Aristotelian
Yeah.
philosophy.
So it's medieval. It's very scholastic.
Yeah,
Scholastic in the sense of not just you read a lot of books, but there was a movement in theology in the Middle Ages called scholasticism,
scholasticism.
and it's
Okay.
exactly what Caleb's describing, heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and
Particularly Aristotle.
reconciling that to the truth of scripture.
Hmm.
Which there's a lot of value in
Air
that.
quotes
Yeah,
reconciling.
reconciling. It's a good exercise. Probably not something that most of our listeners are familiar with unless they grew up Catholic or are
So
Catholic.
stay tuned because we'll probably do an episode on that stuff later. But
So how was that with
so
what
that
you were saying?
yeah, so there are lots of Catholic thinkers who I think would fall broadly under an Augustinian point of
Okay.
view,
Okay.
and Augustine, though not Calvin, and not didn't have a systematized doctrine on this particular issue, I think would agree with him in a lot of points about the bondage of human will and so forth. Calvinism is really going to be the big player in most of our discussions.
Hmm.
There are those who disagree with Calvin, and I would say historically that you have basically a couple of camps that people fall under. People who, because we have an alleged dilemma between God's sovereignty and human free will.
Mhm.
It's an alleged dilemma or a dichotomy that we have to sort of fix, or we've got to reconcile. Most people will either fall broadly under the camp of people who choose the God's sovereignty horn of the dilemma.
Mhm.
So, in other words, they choose to favor God's sovereignty
Mhm.
at the expense of human free will.
Hmm.
And then there are those who will privilege human freedom
Hmm.
and in at the expense of God's sovereignty. Now, what both camps will do is they will claim that they are not expensing the other side, right?
Yes. Yeah.
They
This
will
is
say, if they choose the God's sovereignty one, they'll say, no, I'm not,
yes.
annihilating free will, even though they
This
are.
yeah, this is why if you are ever talk to a Calvinist, the instinctive thing to do if you're not Calvinist is say you don't believe in free will. And then if you're not familiar with these debates, you'll be awestruck by the fact that their first response is, "Of course we believe
Of
in free
course I
will."
do. And so then you end up in this semantic
Mhm.
argument where then the deeper you get into the conversation, you realize that you end up back at square one, which is that they really don't believe in not
Mm.
free will in the terms that you're talking
Yeah.
about free will, or that most people are. And to be fair, the same is often true of the other camp, right? And I'm thinking here of like Arminians and Wesleyans and things of that nature who will, and for good reason. I'm not criticizing. I haven't begun to criticize yet. Um, I,
Buckle up.
either of these camps for good reason. They want to give privileged position to the free will of humanity, and the reason why is because they're thinking of things like culpability for sin and so forth,
Mhm.
right? Well,
Yeah.
they will do the same semantic thing where they will say, "Well, I'm not denying that God is ultimately and totally sovereign."
Mhm.
But then when you sort of press them on some of these issues, it sure sounds like in some ways that
Yeah.
there is a compromise being made with the sovereignty of God, and so these are the camps that you wind up with. So maybe it might be helpful if we just define Calvinism,
Yeah.
Yes.
because I think Calvinism is going to be kind of the lens we look through here. So
Well, let me give my very dumb definition of Calvinism because
okay,
I'm curious to know like how accurate it is and I guess like how much I am familiar with it. So, am I right that Calvinists believe that and this kind of goes back to our time episode in my mind a little bit that God has already ordained everything. He has his sovereignty from the beginning to the end. It's already done and he knows and has ordained who will be saved.
hmm
Um what else am I missing with that and is that even accurate?
so it is fairly accurate insofar as most Calvinists will say that the course of human history is the result of the divine decree, right? So when God says, "Let there be," and there was, that what he has done, so to speak, is he has essentially decreed what the course of history will be. And his creation of it is the tipping over of the
Mhm.
dominoes, so to speak.
It's like he's writing the history book ahead of time.
Yeah, so in the pre-creative moment, if you want to use that language, I mean, we could lapse into the doctrine of time, but again, but I'll just refer you back to that
Mhm.
episode if you're interested in what we think on that. But this idea that in the pre-creative moment, um, God decides what world He wants, and then He decrees that world be. And so, in that sense, from a Calvinist perspective, he is the cause of everything in that world.
Mm.
He is the cause, the ultimate cause. And therefore, everything that happens because of his will. His will is the causing factor of everything that occurs.
Hmm.
And so in that case, I would say Calvinism, just on its face, is deterministic.
Yes.
Jeremy used this word earlier, determinism, this
Mm.
idea that everything that occurs because of a prior condition or cause.
Right.
Mm.
And this would be where Sam Harris would agree with that, except he doesn't believe in God.
Mm.
A Calvinist agrees with Harris's claim that everything that occurs happens from a prior condition or cause. But what they will say is that the prior condition and cause is God.
Okay, so
God
I
is
have
the
a
cause.
follow-up question too, really, that as you're explaining that, I struggle with, which
Hmm.
is how do they view free will under that notion? And also, how do they wrestle with like suffering? Are they saying that everything bad is set by God?
Mm.
That's two big things that really come to my mind with Calvinism.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the buzzword here is going to be a word that you'll hear Calvinists use often and often misuse,
Mm.
which is this word compatibilism. What they will say is that God being the cause of all things and human free will are actually compatible, which is weird because it's almost just a restatement of the issue. It's almost
Hmm.
just a restatement of the problem, right?
Yeah.
Which is that we want these things to be compatible. How are they? Often I have read Calvinist thinkers who will just state compatibilism is true and not give much beyond that. And then when you hear their description of the will of human free will, what you find is that the description is um, very limited.
Hmm.
So that again, this is the camp that they are going to give privileged position to the sovereignty of God. And so I think while they will give semantic lip service to humans having free will, what they really mean is that while it may be possible for humans to make some choices, those choices are prior caused by God.
So it's kind of going back to what you were saying. I don't remember the word you used, but the choice of yes or just don't do it is
Yeah.
that kind of like you're just presented with what you have
Yeah.
and you have a choice to act, but even not acting would still change.
Let me
What?
see if I can. I think I understand what you're saying. I maybe if so it's kind of compatibilism. What you're saying is it's a term that doesn't really mean anything if you assume the deterministic stuff of Calvinism, right? So, for example, if I go out and I make a tool, right? I plan a tool, I design the tool, I make it. That tool is compatible with me, but it's not really a compromise between the tool and myself because I'm the one that brought the tool into existence. I determined its all of its properties, what
Mm,
it looks like, how it's going to be used. And so in that sense, the tool doesn't have any kind of agency.
mm.
It's independent of mine. We're compatible, but that doesn't really mean anything because I'm the one responsible. Is that right? Is that
Yeah,
off
it
base?
could be. I just do want to make it clear though that the compatibilism that they're claiming. Remember, because the discussion we're having here
Hmm.
is the idea is well, is the sovereignty of God and the free will of humanity compatible?
Yeah.
Right. That's our question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Compatibilism from a Calvinistic point of view, though, is actually the claim that determinism and free will are compatible.
Ah, okay. So
Now,
they're trying to like square the circle.
they are trying to say that determinism, which is the claim
Mm,
that God is the cause that determines all actions, and people having free will are compatible.
yeah.
And what I'm trying to argue is that the only way in which that's possible is if you give a radical redefinition of one of those two things.
Mm.
Yes, I think
Right.
that's right
Eh,
because if you because then what you're saying is well the free will of humanity is always going to agree with the sovereignty of God. And then that leads into issues of human fallenness,
yes.
sin. It's like, well,
Right.
how do you make
Yeah.
that
This
make
gets to
sense?
Courtney's
Yeah.
question where she's talking about suffering,
Yeah.
right?
Mm.
And this I think has been probably the primary um, and I'm gonna say this, and then I'm gonna give a little bit more detailed definition of what Calvinism affirms. But this has been one of the main criticisms of Calvinism throughout history, and even up until today, which is that if determinism is true, then God is the author of sin and evil.
Yes.
Which is to say, if he's the cause of all things, and one of the things that happen is sin and evil,
Right.
and continue to happen actually.
Right.
Now, there are several steps in which Calvinists will attempt to try to sort of dodge this bullet, and they'll say things like, well, humans act according to their own nature, and their own nature is sinful, and so like they act according to their nature, and that's not God's not responsible for that. And I of course want to push back and say, well, how is he not responsible if he's the
Yeah.
cause?
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
because they don't want to divorce this idea that God's the cause of all things.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So it seems really difficult to avoid that
That's also a
conclusion.
historically contingent argument.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take into account how sin entered the world in the first place.
Mm.
Human nature was not always sinful.
There's debate too about infralapsarianism and
Yeah.
supralapsarianism, which we
All these words. I cannot.
I mean, yeah.
we
it's-
don't have to get into it. I just want to gesture
Yeah, no,
towards it
that's fair.
for the sake of people who want to look that up, maybe, because there's debate amongst Calvinists about did God determine the first sin?
Yeah.
Right. And there are, believe it or not, a lot of Calvinist thinkers on both sides of that argument.
Yeah.
Some will say,
Okay.
yeah, he caused the first sin. So maybe we should give just the 5 points of
Okay.
Calvinism.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's do that.
The 5 points of Calvinism, often called TULIP, right? Which is an acronym that stands for total depravity,
Mm-hmm.
unconditional election,
Mm-hmm.
limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
Yeah.
Okay.
So each of these are a distinct doctrine. We don't have time to sort of dive into each one of them, but basically the basic idea of each one of them, total depravity, is the idea that humans are sinful in every part of their being. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're as sinful as we possibly could be, but it does mean that we're sinful in the totality of our being.
We can't pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps
Yeah,
to do good things.
Because we're infected by sin. I'm not going to endorse or criticize each one of them. I'm just going to present them. So then the next one is unconditional election, which is this claim that God has chosen certain peoples to be saved, to be redeemed by the cross, and that there is no precondition for why he chose them. He just chose who he willed to choose.
And I feel like this is like the biggest hot topic when it comes to Calvinism
Yeah,
that I've heard of.
It's a big one. It's a real big hang up for a lot of people.
Well, my biggest one is the next one.
Yeah, I think it's my biggest one as well, which is the L is limited atonement.
Mm.
That is to say that Christ did not die for all people, but rather that Christ
Yikes.
died only for the elect.
Yeah,
so
it is a yikes. Yeah.
Oh man. Okay. I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, so the unconditional election, the claim that God has elected a certain people to be saved, then this connects. They try to follow it logically and say, well, if he only elected to save a certain people, then those are the people that he died for. And so they'll say that the atonement therefore is limited in its scope. And then irresistible grace, which is to say those whom he called, the people that he has unconditionally elected and died for, will be saved. God's going to save them. And the grace that he extends to them to save them is irresistible.
Yep.
That they will be drawn to saving faith. And then the last one is perseverance of the saints, which is, a lot of our listeners might have heard of eternal security,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or once saved, always saved in some cases, which might be kind of a caricature in some ways of the view. But it just is the view that the elect, the people who are saved by this irresistible grace, are not going to fall away. They'll remain to the end, right?
One way or another. They're going to get there.
They'll make it. Yeah. So these are the called the doctrines of grace often, or TULIP for short. And I think that the ones that we don't have time, I would love to
Let's do a power ranking of the 5 doctrines of No, I'm just joking.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that actually, and just sort of like levy whatever criticisms I have.
Part 3 of this series.
Yeah. But the ones that relate to free will, I guess, would be unconditional election and irresistible grace. I think would be the ones that really relate to free will.
They
Yeah.
all do,
They all
but
do, yeah.
those in particular, yeah.
Total depravity also plays a role because of the thing I mentioned earlier. Like they'll say you act according to your nature, and if your nature is that you're totally depraved, then you don't have the will to be able to reach out to God.
Yeah.
And
Which goes
so
back to the idea of coercion, right?
coercion, right? So they say, look,
Mm.
you can't be saved because you are totally depraved, and it is your nature to always act sinfully and in opposition to God's will.
Yeah.
In which case, you don't have free will. You're bound. And other reformers, talk about this. The bondage of the will is something
Yeah.
that Luther talked about a lot as well. So this idea that your will is bound by sin at least. And so you don't actually possess the capacity to reach out to God. God is the sole worker
Mhm.
in salvation. And the term here for this is monergism.
Mhm.
Mm.
Mono meaning one, energy or it's the where we get the word energy. This idea of work or action, power, right? Which is to say that there is one actor or there is one um, working power in salvation. And that one working power in salvation is God, not us.
Mhm.
God is the one who saves. We don't save ourselves.
In the context of the Reformation, you can see why developing these kinds of doctrines would be important. Because Luther and the other reformers, their challenge to the Catholic Church, among practical reforms, was salvation by grace through faith.
That's right.
And so if it's by grace through faith, it's not something we earn. It's not our actions. We don't have to do things. You can see how that initial concern could develop into doctrines like this. You're saying God is the only power. If it's nothing we can do, then obviously it's God, something God does. So there's a connection there. There's a historical kind of impetus behind this, but that's not to say it's the only way that we can express the fundamental ideas.
Yeah, so it's what you're getting at, I think, is that it's motivated by theologically good reason,
Mhm.
right? This idea that we want to defend the sovereignty of God, of course,
Mm.
that's what we've been talking about the whole time. We also want to defend this idea against this idea that humans can save themselves, or that we are co-workers in salvation.
Mhm.
Right, this idea that God and humanity work together to save humanity,
Mhm.
that's heresy.
That is heresy.
That we don't believe that. No
Mm.
Christian believes that or should believe that.
Mm.
And so this is one of the things I think that the reformers are trying to protect against. They're fencing against this threat by saying, look, no, God is the only one who acts. And I think that from a biblical point of view, that's very defensible. The idea that God is the sole worker of salvation, God is the source of all that is, and He is sovereign over all. These are all really robust biblical themes that can be defended really strongly with the text.
Yeah.
So I almost want to say that from a biblical point of view, I'm almost on the same team as the Calvinists, but where we part ways and part ways hard is they take the data from what the text teaches, which is that God is sovereign, He is the sole worker of salvation, all those things that I mentioned, and then they give philosophical explanation, which in this case is determinism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They'll say, well, how could this be? Well, the answer is determinism. God
Yeah.
causes everything. And that's where I would say, whoa, 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 whoa,
Yeah.
whoa.
So
where
you
lose me.
agree with the biblical points.
Mm-hmm. But
You-
how we
you-
explain those
You
points.
disagree with the philosophical explanation.
That's right.
of
That's
those
where they
points.
lose me.
Mm.
They lose me.
Yeah.
And they give a philosophical solution, it seems to me, that undermines their biblical point of view, because then it seems to contradict
Yeah.
the portrait that Scripture says elsewhere
Yeah.
about human free will, about evil and suffering, and God not being responsible for those things, and so forth. So there's lots of it sort of tips the scales back in the other direction that makes it seem like an unbiblical doctrine to me at that point. So I'm tipping my hand there in terms of like where I'm not a Calvinist.
I mean, I'm not either. I'm sure if we had a Calvinist on the podcast, they could probably, give us some stuff to think about. But
yeah,
I'm with Caleb on this. In the most general outlines, I do think that very large and well aimed bullet of did God cause sin
Mm.
is a core problem with Calvinism, because if you are going to be deterministic and identify God as the root source of everything, then you can't really get around the idea that God caused sin to happen, which would be a contradiction in terms based on God's character.
And it affects every area of theology
Hmm.
because it's a serious problem for theology proper,
Yeah.
right? This idea that the doctrine of God, because if God is the good, if he
Yeah.
is the source of the good,
Right,
it's
yeah.
not possible for him to cause evil and
Yeah,
suffering.
and the way Calvinists frame this sometimes is like, well, yeah, but like evil happened so that good might abound even more. And like the end result is a greater good because of the incarnation of Jesus and the glory of the And all of that is true, but at the end of the day, you still have to deal with like, yeah, but was it really God's plan that like a certain amount of people were captive to sin and
Well, I think it's even worse than just saying, I mean, because those sort of theodicies, this claim that well, look, there's greater goods that result, or it all
Mhm.
serves to for the glory of God, which is something that Reformed thinkers will say often. Um, I'm sort of like, I'm on board with that part of
Yeah,
it
as am
as
I.
as an explanation for why such suffering is permitted in the world.
Right.
But the problem I'm having is that you're not saying that the suffering and evil is permitted. You're saying that it's
Saying
caused
that
Yeah.
God caused
by
it.
God.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like a big thing I'm thinking about is like Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, like, how do you reconcile that kind of stuff and say, so they're
Yeah.
saying that God orchestrated that,
Yeah.
he ordained that to
Yeah.
happen.
Well, even natural disasters too.
Yes.
It's so there's a book that I really, really like that is way too complicated to summarize here, and it's more impressionistic and kind of just giving you things to think about than anything. It's in response to the Indonesian tsunami.
Hmm.
It's called The Doors of the Sea. It's by a guy who went off the rails a few years ago, so don't read his recent stuff, but it's by David Bentley Hart.
Yikes.
It's called The Doors of the Sea, and this was back when he was, a fairly traditional, he had good biblical
Before he
views of
lost
God.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. But and he goes hard against Calvinism in that book. And he basically says, this is kind of a messed up view of God if you think that like it is a great and glorious plan for the tsunami to kill, tons of people.
Mhm.
And to be fair, maybe to our Calvinist brethren, and let me just say this: like, I probably, in terms of works of theology, I've probably read more Reformed work than any other in terms of a school of thought. So I've benefited greatly from their insight into God's Word and count them as brothers and sisters in Christ. So I want to be fair to them. I think many of them would really resist the portrait because of the impulse inside their own heart to say
Yeah.
like, no, that's not the God that I believe in.
Yeah.
And they will say, look, no, there is again to that claim, determinism,
Mhm.
God causing all things, and free will are compatible. And they'll want to say that because they still want to dump the culpability and
Yeah.
responsibility for evil things happening in the camp of humanity. The problem is that I think from a logical point of view, even if they want to say that in terms of logic, the inevitable consequence of their system leads to these consequences,
Yeah.
whether they like it or not.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my biggest hang up with what we've been talking about is I think in order to adopt that viewpoint, I would have to alter my view of God
Yeah.
and like the
Yeah.
doctrine that I see. So
Yeah.
that's really hard to reconcile for me.
If
So
you're
we
yeah,
yeah.
if you're being consistent, you would
Yeah.
want something would have to give.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So Calvinism, what other viewpoints are there out there um in regards to this that we want to I know there's
There's a
probably
lot.
a
There's a
lot.
lot of views. Yeah.
There's a
Um,
ton. I mean, the most popular one is actually probably a form of heresy to varying degrees.
and that one
The
is
heresy is Pelagianism, which is what Caleb was talking about earlier, where it's the idea that like, in basic forms we can earn our salvation,
mhm,
Mm.
but in more fancy forms, it's we contribute to the work of
It's a
salvation from our
cooperative work.
yeah, from
Yeah.
our own free will, from our own resources. We bring something to the table. And this is often the knee jerk reaction to people who are from people who are not Calvinists. because unfortunately, the Calvinist tradition has a lot of very good theologians and places a lot of emphasis on theology. The Wesleyan Arminian tradition, not so much. It tends to be a more, for various reasons we don't have time to go into. The people who are Wesleyan and Arminian tend not to place as much of an emphasis on formal theology. There are some great
Yeah.
Wesleyan and
Or
Arminian
at
theologians
least systematized
and
theology.
systematize. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the point. But there are some really good theological alternatives that are not heretical and are not Calvinism. And I know Caleb loves one in particular.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the overwhelming majority of people who are not Calvinists would probably want to call themselves some form of an Arminian or
Mhm.
Wesleyan Arminian, something like that. Um, and I'm not going to devote the same kind of time to that view as we did to Calvinism, in part because it's not clear. I guess to me, it's not as clear because of that lack of systemization. It's not as clear to me what the claims are, except that it does take a different approach insofar as rather than privileging the sovereignty and causal power of God, instead it gives more platform to the free will of humanity.
So it's almost swinging the opposite
It swings in the opposite
direction.
direction, but they'll want to resist this charge that Jeremy said, which is Pelagianism, right? We're not students of Darth Pelagius the Wise, right? Uh,
5 of our listeners, if we're lucky, will get that
understand that
Yeah, I
reference.
have
reference.
no idea what that just said.
Yeah. So but this claim of that is a cooperative work between the person who's saved and the main worker of salvation, which is God. The Everyone wants, in theory, to be a monergist. Remember, I talked about monergism, the claim that there's one worker in salvation. Everyone wants to be. I fear sometimes that on the Arminian camp, that a lot of people are practically Pelagians because what they describe does sound like we choose God, that kind of thing. Um, Whereas what I want to, the solution that I want to give is actually not even really a soteriology. Soteriology is the doctrine of salvation, right? How God saves. Um, and I think that we we might have answers to this problem of salvation in the doctrine of God's knowledge might actually help us to sort of answer the question. Yeah.
Say more.
So so
Rant further, please.
yeah, because this is going to get into a rant. Well, this actually does play into maybe something that we talked about in the Time episode,
Okay.
a particular movie. So if you've seen Avengers: Infinity War, so in
If you've seen it, come on.
everyone's seen
That's
it.
crazy if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I get all of my theology from comic book movies.
Yeah. Same. So I'm just using this as a gateway in. Okay,
Yeah.
this isn't.
No, I like this movie a lot.
Yeah.
I'm not dogging on the movie.
So in Infinity War, at the end of Infinity War, spoilers for a movie everyone's saying, you have this sequence where Doctor Strange is kind of wigging out, and Mantis is like, "Does he always do that?" And they look at him.
His face is like twitching, and his
Yeah,
like
yeah,
eye
yeah.
is like he's in REM, but he's like kind of he's got like little motion blurs
Yeah,
as if
yeah,
he's
yeah,
moving.
yeah.
It's like what the crud is
And
going on?
and he snaps out of it, and he's like, they're like, "What were you doing?" And he was like, He uses time because he has the time stone.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that time plays a role in this, but just conceptually, what he says is that he looks at all of the alternative futures, right? If you're a nerd, comment below how many alternative futures he looked at. But he looks at these alternative futures and determines in how many of these alternative possible futures do the Avengers defeat Thanos. And then Tony Stark's like, "How many?" And he goes, "One."
Yeah.
We all know which one that is. That's sad. But this is the claim, is that he looks into possible futures and determines which one is the optimal one for their issue here.
So at that moment, Doctor Strange has a practically omniscient view of reality.
That's right.
So we're connecting it back to the doctrine of God.
That's right. Yeah.
Avengers fictional.
Yeah. So
Like,
this is
we don't want to put too much weight, but
No.
but that's the stepping stone.
That's the analogy here, which is this claim of, okay, so if you did possess omniscience of some sort,
Yeah.
So the cognitive capacity to examine possible futures or possible circumstances.
Yeah.
Um, would this play a role in terms of the course of human history?
Well, in order to have that many different possibilities would affirm free will, right? I mean, in
Yeah,
order to be able to have different options,
that's right.
you have to have free will.
That's right.
That's a good point.
That's an excellent observation. So this idea is not it's not it doesn't come from Avengers and it also doesn't come from Caleb, right? This is actually a pretty old idea. The first person who's really credited with this idea, and the idea that we're talking about here is the doctrine of middle knowledge. And I'll explain that term here in just a moment.
Hmm.
But the doctrine of middle knowledge comes from a 16th century Jesuit reformer by the name of Luis de Molina.
Hmm.
Molina, and so therefore this school of thought has been termed Molinism
Mhm.
because of
Yeah.
this. Um, he basically said, look, there are a few different kinds of knowledge that God has. Sometimes we'll just say, well, God's omniscient and just use this umbrella and say, well, God knows all things. He knows all truths, right? But Molina said, well, actually, that's not robust enough a picture of what it is that God knows. God has knowledge. So typically, theologians have split God's knowledge into two camps. They'll say God has natural knowledge,
Hmm.
right, which is God's knowledge of all possibilities. Now, you might be thinking about back to like the Avengers thing. Well, isn't that the same kind of knowledge? Not exactly. I'll explain. But he says, look, God has a knowledge of all things that could be, that he could, all the worlds he could create.
Mm.
And then he has a second type of knowledge, which is God's free knowledge. The reason it's called free knowledge is because this is the knowledge that of what he has freely decided to create,
Hmm.
right? So you have the knowledge of all the possibilities, natural knowledge, and then you have the knowledge of the one that God freely
Right.
decided to make, which is the actual world
The knowledge of what is
or what will be, right? So,
will
so
be.
in other words, so when he decrees, "Let there be," and he creates the world, now his knowledge is locked in
Hmm.
because he knows all the things that will come to pass.
Even the unlimited amount of options within that world that he
Well, we'll
created.
get to the
Okay,
options.
I
We'll get
have
to the
lots of
options,
questions.
right? Because so the portrait that I just painted about God's natural knowledge and his free knowledge, Calvinists like this, right? They're fine with this
Hmm.
portrait
Okay.
because they'll say, yeah, God has all these possible things he could do. But then they say he decides and decrees that he's going to make one and he causes those things to happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so of
Tracking.
course he has free knowledge of all that will take place because he's the one who caused all that will to take place, right? Now, Molina says, well, there's another category that we need to sort of create to explain this. And he says, in between God's natural and his free knowledge is something called middle
Okay.
knowledge.
Okay.
That's
Gotcha.
why it's called that. And when I say in between, we're talking about logically. This isn't
Yeah.
even a chronological.
Yeah.
God has all this knowledge at one time, but
Right.
logically, how we can conceptualize
Yeah.
it. Not only does he know all the things that could be, that's possibility, right? All the things that could be. And not only does he have knowledge of all that will be, that's
Mhm.
free knowledge, but he also has knowledge of what would be,
What would be?
right?
I like that.
Now you see there's a difference because what could is just pure possibility.
Mhm.
Hmm.
What will is certainty in his mind of something that is going to occur.
Absolute.
And what would is possibility under specific given circumstances.
Yep. It's conditional.
It's conditional.
It says if this happens, then what else would happen?
Yeah, and that's actually called a subjunctive conditional,
Yep.
right? If you're a grammar nerd.
Yep.
So
Not me.
it's an if then statement, right? So
Like-
if Courtney made Caleb a salad, he would not eat
Not
it.
eat
Mhm.
it at all.
Mhm.
And that's for certain.
Right. And so this is a middle knowledge claim because it's a counterfactual. And
Yeah.
the reason why it's counterfactual is because it's not the case. She
Yep.
didn't actually make me a
'Cause-
salad.
So what you're saying is God, like these things don't have to be real and never have to happen for God to know exactly what would happen if they did.
To know the counterfactual
Yes.
truth about what would have happened if this
Mm.
was the case,
Yeah.
right? And so this is now you start thinking about it, you start thinking, wow, if this is the case, this is a really robust doctrine of God's omniscience.
Which is, I
Mhm.
want to point this out too, because sometimes Calvinists say, well, the Arminians don't have a high enough view of God's sovereignty and stuff. This is a higher view than determinism.
Yes, it
Like
is.
this to me at least seems more a robust depiction and something that is
Yeah.
even more marvelous than
Mm.
just the idea that God determines something and then it
And
just
here's
happens in motion.
why it's more robust in terms of God's sovereignty. We'll get to the free will part here in just a second, but
Mm.
the sovereignty part, the reason why I think it's more robust than Calvinism is because Calvinism says, well, God, the only way that God has sovereignty and control over a particular thing, he has to cause it by
He,
his force of will.
Mhm.
he's the puppet
He's
master.
the puppet master, which is almost, in my mind, a symbol of weakness, right?
Mhm.
Which is to say, the only way that God can bring this about is that he forces someone to do it.
Yeah.
Which is, that doesn't glorify God in my mind. That actually limits God because it says, well, he doesn't have very many resources except behind his will, except for brute force and
Mm.
power, right?
Yeah.
Whereas on this view, the claim is, if you haven't already started to wander there in your mind already, the claim is that because God has this kind of knowledge, he knows what you would do under any given circumstance freely.
Freely.
Now, that's the
That's a
key word.
yeah, nice.
He knows what you would freely do without coercion in any given circumstance.
I don't want to jump ahead here. Is there biblical evidence for this?
Yes,
I
there
had
is.
that on
Sorry,
my question.
sorry, that's a leading question. Caleb, if you all don't know, the thought of Molinism comforts him as he falls asleep at night. And I like when I think of Caleb, the thing that he has most strongly contributed to my knowledge of theology is Molinism. He so he knows this backwards and forwards. And I'm asking, somewhat teasingly, is there biblical evidence? Because he shared some with me, and he'll share some with you.
Yeah, there is biblical evidence, and one of the reasons why I'm comforted when I nod off to sleep by this is because of what William Lane Craig has said, which I think that, and I'll just say in terms of my discovering of this, there are a couple of people who are responsible for it. Because I wasn't just sitting around reading 16th century Jesuit works, right, to discover Molina. He was kind of obscure for a long time,
Mhm.
frankly, in the world of theology. But then I read a book by Alvin Plantinga,
Mhm.
who
Mhm.
Alvin Plantinga, who had written a book called God, Freedom, and Evil,
Yeah.
where he discusses the problem of evil, which is something I'm sure we'll discuss in a future episode, right? The problem of evil, and he gives what's called the free will defense. And when he gives the free will defense, he uses this defense of middle knowledge, God's free will. And William Lane Craig is another philosopher who's sort of adopted this point of view. And Craig says that it might be the most fruitful theological thing because of all of the different areas of theology it touches.
Mm.
It touches so many different areas of
Yeah.
theology that it can be extraordinarily helpful. And there is biblical evidence.
Okay.
The episode that I'm thinking of, and I don't know if I don't have my Bible in front of me for the citation exactly, but there is this episode where David is fleeing Saul and his men, and this is a quite an extraordinary time in David's life.
This is 1 Samuel 23.
1 Samuel 23, and he is concerned that the men of Keilah will deliver him over to Saul's men,
Mhm.
and to the hands of Saul. And he has an ephod, which is a sort of a priestly divining object in this case. It's kind of like a magic 8 ball, and
It's a sanctified magic 8 ball.
sanctified, right?
That's
And he starts to talk to God, to Yahweh, David does, and starts to ask him, um, if I stay here, will the men of Keilah deliver me over to Saul? Do you want to read any part of it?
yeah, I will. So he gets the ephod. Then this is verse 10, 1 Samuel 23. Then David said, O Lord, the God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, the God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, He will come down. Then David said, Will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, They will surrender you. Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition.
Interesting. Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons. One, you might read this and just sort of gloss over this and attribute it to the foreknowledge of God. God knows the future. Except there's a problem here, which is
Yeah.
that none of it happened.
Yeah. David left Keilah.
Yeah. It didn't happen because David took God's knowledge that he shared with him and avoided that outcome
Yep.
by leaving. And so what we have here is not just simple foreknowledge of the future,
Because it never happened.
because it never happened. This is middle
Middle
knowledge.
yeah.
This is God's knowledge of what would have happened had David remained instead of departing. And so I think that, we could probably just stop there in terms of the biblical, because that's pretty crystal clear.
That's the main one I think
That's
of.
the main one. Now there are others. I mean, and there, some people will dispute some of the others. Jesus says, "Woe to you, Bethsaida and Chorazin! If the men of Sodom and Gomorrah had heard what you have heard, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes." Right? Now, some people will say, "Well, that's hyperbole. Jesus isn't really." Is he? Or is he giving knowledge? It's not clear to me. But then the apostles will refer to alternative possibility like this too. They'll say things like, if the rulers and authorities had known who Christ was, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory.
Well, and the bigger thing from the Keilah episode is that David knows he can ask this kind of question.
He assumes that God
Yeah.
has this knowledge.
Yeah.
He makes the assumption God knows what would happen under different circumstances, and so he avoids it by changing. And so God possesses this knowledge, and the claim here is that if he knows what every person would do under any given circumstance that he could create, then and what they would freely do in those circumstances, right? This isn't that God knows because he caused them. It's
Yeah.
because this is what they would freely choose to do in that circumstance. Then God has the power, given that he is the creator of the world, whatever reality, whatever possible world he decides to create, he's the one who decides that. And so he knows, if I were to create world A, Courtney would do B. Right? But if I were to create world B, Courtney would freely do C, right? And so he knows in his natural knowledge and in his middle knowledge the possibilities and what would happen under these different given circumstances. And so he creates the world and places people in circumstances where they freely choose to do according to, yes, their will, but also according to his will.
Yep. So what you're saying is this type of knowledge, middle knowledge, is necessary to preserve both human free will and divine sovereignty.
Yes. Because what happens here is that you get what the Calvinist wants, which is meticulous sovereignty and providence over every action and every event in human history. You have God, his perfect will take place, right? And he can accomplish the ends of his will without fail, okay? And so you have meticulous divine sovereignty. Score one for the Calvinists. But you also get what the Arminians and the Wesleyans want, which is that human beings have genuine, real free will, and they are not being caused to do anything. They are freely choosing in the circumstances, in the world, in the reality that they live in, and the choices that they have the volition and the power. And this goes back to what you were talking about, yes, there are confines of our reality that quote unquote limit our choices, in the same way that I don't have the power to jump off the roof of a building and fly away.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm constrained by gravity. So in that sense, I'm constrained by the circumstances of the world that I'm in. But in that world, I have total freedom. I have free will.
Yeah.
And so
it's like if you're playing checkers, there are plenty of choices to make. But at the end of the day, if you're playing checkers, you have to play checkers.
Yeah, there are only so many spaces on the
Yeah.
board, right? So this is it's going to accomplish what the Arminian and the Wesleyan wants, because you're going to say, look, humans have free will, and maybe most importantly of all, for both sides, is that in this case, God's sovereignty and human free will are actually compatible here, and God is not the author of sin and evil,
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right.
because it is still the result of human free
Yeah.
choice.
So you could
Yeah.
say, from the divine perspective, there was a point at which the question, if I create humanity, what would happen if they sin? If they sin, what would happen? If this person makes this choice, what would happen?
Right.
That's how we reconcile these two.
Well,
Right.
and
And
I really like this viewpoint because unlike my struggles with Calvinism, and I think you had maybe said this, is that it really um it makes me think about my doctrine of God and like his omniscience. Like it's even more meaningful and more impactful in this way. I don't know how to
yeah.
quite
No, I think
say
you're
what I'm thinking.
no, I mean I think I know what you mean exactly, because it actually kind of makes me in awe of God,
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
because the in awe of the infinite nature
Yeah.
of his wisdom and knowledge. And it also gives me, goes back to that comforting me to sleep thing that Jeremy's talking about. It does provide incredible comfort, because what it gives me is trust
Mhm.
that God has weighed all of the
Yeah.
possibilities, and he knows what he even knows what I would do under circumstances that I haven't ever seen or never will
Right.
see.
Yeah.
And because of that, I can have trust in his plan,
Yeah.
that his plan of providence is, and there are hints of this throughout the scriptures, right? I mean, the one I've quoted in other episodes and I quote all the time, of course, is the Joseph one,
Mhm.
which I think on middle knowledge makes beautiful sense. It's kind of mysterious otherwise, where Joseph's brothers come to him because of the famine,
Mm.
and they're fearful for his wrath because of their sin against him. And he says, what you intended for evil,
Right.
God intended for good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on middle knowledge, this makes actually perfect
Mm.
sense, which is to say that the brothers of Joseph acted freely and sinned willfully against him and intended it for evil purposes. But God, in his omniscience, knew what would happen if he allowed them to carry out these sins against Joseph, and that ultimately it would wind up putting Joseph in the palace of Pharaoh,
Mhm.
and actually allowing Joseph to be the means of their salvation in the famine.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so he actually has an intention for good for the evil intentions of humanity.
Right.
And so this is how now we can start thinking about gospel things, right? And you
Mhm.
can start thinking about, okay, well, what about the cross,
Yeah.
the greatest sin that's ever been perpetrated, and yet we know he is the Lamb who was slain before the foundations of the earth. What does that mean? It means that it was Plan A. This
Yeah.
was the plan all along.
God knew what would happen if
He
Jesus came to earth.
That's right. He knew that if Christ were born in Bethlehem and lived in the region of Judea during the reign of Pontius Pilate, that the Jewish Sanhedrin would convict him and so forth, and know that he would be able to die for the sins of humanity in this way.
Yeah.
And so he uses, yes, the free will decision. This is why Peter can stand up on the day of Pentecost and say that you, by the hands of lawless men, crucified the Lord. You're guilty. And then a couple chapters later in Acts, he's able to say, Lord, everything that your hand decided to do, all that your will wanted to do in delivering Christ to the cross and having him resurrected has been done. Your sovereignty has played out.
Mhm.
And he can say this without there being any tension in his mind,
Mm.
because both of these things are true. We have two wills at play, and neither is being encroached upon by the other because of God's omniscience and that awe-inspiring
Yeah. It just
ability.
really makes you appreciate, and it doesn't I say this with caution, but even in our mistakes, it doesn't matter what we do. He already knows the outcome, and we can but we need to come to him and get that discernment and that wisdom to know what to do. But ultimately, he knows what's
Yeah,
going to
it
happen. It's
comforts us
yeah,
in his sovereignty and in his providence, and yet it doesn't absolve us from culpability,
right,
right?
right,
It maintains that we're responsible for the actions that we take.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a
Mhm.
really, really powerful thing.
It is. Yeah.
Is there, as we start to wrap up, are there books on this topic that you would encourage people to read, and not just about Molinism, but just God's sovereignty, free will? Any books that y'all would recommend?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a so I will just caution people who want to read about this particular topic that it can be a little philosophical, right? I
Mm,
mean, it's kind of a little bit complicated. And so that there are some works that are tougher. A good introduction might be um, something like Kirk McGregor has written a biography of Luis de Molina, wherein he spends a lot of time talking about this doctrine because this is kind of the crowning achievement of Molina's career. So that book I think is a good one. If you want to read something that's a little bit more advanced, then you could read something like The Only Wise God by William Lane Craig.
okay.
It's a short book, but it's dense,
Mm,
and so I'll just caution people that it is dense. Yeah,
I think on my part, so not that I endorse everything that's in it, but I think it is a very good work for thinking biblically and robustly through Armenian theology in a more systematic way than a lot of ones do. It's a book just called Armenian Theology, Myths and Realities by Roger E. Olson,
yeah,
Olson. So as I mean, I read a lot of academic stuff, but as someone who doesn't read a ton of theology, I was still able to kind of, follow this.
yeah,
And that one I think is pretty good. And I think I got the sense at least that it was giving a fair account of the Calvinism it was arguing against and being, very responsible about some of Arminianism's blind spots, while also presenting a very thorough case for Arminian theology and
right,
what a biblical, non-heretical view of that looks
yeah,
like.
yeah. I don't agree with Olson much, but I think he's probably one of the clearer thinkers on that particular topic. Yeah, for sure.
all right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. If this sparked any questions, or if you're unlike Caleb and you're being lulled to sleep by this, maybe it's keeping you awake at night because you want to know more. Welcome to the club, because that's me. But send us your thoughts, share this with a friend, and come back next week as we keep babbling.